We have another very long gospel story today, so I'll invite you to stay seated, but the gospel can be found on page 873 in your pew Bibles. All right. John chapter 11, beginning with verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you are going to go there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Well, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laying against it. Jesus said, "Take away this stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Hope. Hope is a powerful and positive force. Since the beginning of time, hope has moved individuals and groups forward, even through the most difficult of circumstances. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish German psychiatrist, wrote of his experience of being imprisoned in a concentration camp during World War II. And he quotes from his experience. "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." As Frankl suggests, even in the face of hopelessness, all is not lost, as the choice exists to choose our attitude, and such an attitude that can be adopted is one of hope. This personal hope does more than help an individual to endure. It also gives hope to others. Hope is contagious. Today in our gospel story, we hear a remarkable story, a story of hope found in the most hopeless of places. We find hope in the tomb of Lazarus. We know that Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha, were Jesus' dearest friends, almost like family. When Lazarus becomes sick, his sisters send a message to Jesus, and for reasons that seem strange to me, Jesus procrastinates, waiting 4 days before heading to Bethany. And as a result, when he arrives, he is told that Lazarus has already been dead and in the tomb for 4 days. Anyone who has ever disappointed a family member will have no trouble imagining the tone of Martha's voice when she welcomed Jesus. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Martha, no doubt, needed comforting, a hug perhaps, but instead she receives a theological discourse, which included one of the great Jesus on Jesus I am statements. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." From this point on, you know the story. Mary joins her sister. She does not lecture Jesus. She simply weeps, along with their circle of close friends. And John tells us that deeply moved by their grief, Jesus weeps with them. In the final scene, Jesus asks to be taken to the tomb, and the sisters lead him there. When Jesus expresses a desire to have the tomb opened, The sisters and everyone express concern. But the men willingly satisfy Jesus' request, and they move the stone, and then Jesus calls to Lazarus, and Lazarus comes out. Now, what happens next is a critical moment in this epic story, yet it can easily be overlooked. After Jesus calls Lazarus by name to come out of the tomb, John tells us that Jesus commands the gathered crowd to unbind him and let him go. The community of mourners, therefore, is commanded to participate in God's action. They are recruited to help complete God's redemptive act. Unbind him and let him go. Isn't this astonishing when you think about it? That community of faith gathered around Lazarus is invited into this work of salvation. Yes, the raising of Lazarus from death to new life is entirely Jesus' work. And yet Jesus invites the community to participate. Jesus invites the community to do something essential and meaningful and important. Jesus did not have to issue this command. He could have just as easily gone over to Lazarus himself and unwrapped him and given him a heartfelt and congratulatory smack on the back on his return from the dead. But rather linger in the limelight of his miracle, Jesus invites those to get involved, to play a part in seeing this miracle move forward. Unbind him and let him go. We are the mourners gathered outside of Lazarus' tomb. This command is for us. We are not only called to be witnesses of God's action in our lives, but also to be changed by what we see. We are invited into this ongoing reality of what God is doing. God does the miracle, but God also gives us a part to play as it unfolds in our life. So what is our part? Well, our part is to first recognize that God's saving work is not just a future promise, some promise that exists for us only after we die. Rather, salvation is happening today. We are already enjoying God's promise of new life. And because we can trust that God's promise of new life is now as well as in the future, we are free to throw ourselves into caring for our neighbor and creation, responding to those who are in need, seeking to help those who are hurting and infecting others with our contagious hope. Unbind him and let him go. Well, where do we hear this command for us today? What challenges and opportunities do we see around us? Where can we claim God's resurrection, promise, and power now, making a difference in someone's life now? And it doesn't have to be huge, although it might be. It doesn't have to take a long time, although it might. It doesn't have to be spectacular, but who knows, maybe it will be. Hope abounds. Opportunities to unbind others and help others let go abound. But we need to look for them because it does make a difference. Communities who practice the act of unbinding one another truly make a difference. These differences are actually measurable. Studies have shown that being around supportive and caring people can actually change your brain chemistry, increasing levels of serotonin, stabilizing moods. Scientists believe that we are hardwired to be around others. It is necessary for people to connect with others on a deep emotional level. And this tenacity of community is what makes it possible for unbinding to happen. We see it with people who are struggling with addiction, with those working through trauma or grief or sickness. Musician Eric Clapton writes about his recovery in his memoirs. After his plunge into sex, drugs, and rock blues, Eric Clapton sobered up at the age of 42. And he talks about the 2 times he went to a residential treatment center and the new way of life he found in recovery. Throughout, he had people supporting him. At the time of his memoir, 10 years ago, Clapton writes, "The last 10 years have been the best of my life. They have been filled with love and a deep sense of satisfaction, not because what I have achieved, but more because what has been bestowed on me." Clapton's new feeling of being unbound and set loose from addiction comes from deep emotional connections with others. Clapton confirms what we have known for millennia. Human beings need to live in a community where they feel a sense of belonging, where they don't feel alone. Unbind him and let him go. While we call this scene in our gospel story the raising of Lazarus, it's interesting to realize that the actual miracle Jesus performs takes up just 2 verses of the 45 of the whole story. And maybe that's because, as is typical of John's gospel, what matters most isn't the miracle, but rather Jesus' interpretation of it and our response to it. After all, Lazarus will die again. But the community empowered by Jesus to unbind and set loose will endure. And indeed, it has endured, persisting through centuries and works of courage and mercy, right down to this blessed community here at Trinity. From the tiniest of us to the more experienced of us, we can all be part of this work. There is this wonderful story about parents who are angling for a bit more time with their coffee and morning paper. And they offer their young daughter a puzzle to put together. On one side of an insert of the paper was a current map of the world. So they cut it up, and they told her that they would go for a walk with her just as soon as she had completed the puzzle. Well, fairly happy with themselves, they settled down with their second cup of coffee. 2 minutes later, she came back and said, "I'm all done." "Well, how did you manage that?" they asked. "It was easy. There is a person on the other side of the page. So I put the person together and the world followed." Life begins with relationships, listening, waiting with each other, realizing that we are part of something so much bigger than just ourselves. If we are to be part of God's work of bringing life and justice, healing and hope into the world, then we need to begin with ourselves and the possibilities that our changed lives may bring to the world. Hope abounds. Thanks be to God. And in our Thanksgiving moment for today, we give thanks for our crew who just returned last night from Jamaica. They were at West Haven's Children's Home for 1 week, working with the people there, continuing relationships with the people there. We give thanks for their safe return, but we also give thanks for the ways in which you supported this with your donations of those suitcases and all the things that went into the suitcases. There's some really lovely photos on the webpage of those items being distributed. I was told that that will last them a year, which will be just in time for us to go back next year. The experience was wonderful. I'm sure the people have come back changed, and we're excited to hear how this will spark the Spirit here to continue to move us forward. We give thanks for God for the gift of relationships, for the gift of your generosity in those donations. We continue now with the receiving of our offering.